when 18-year-old Hannah Graham vanished into the night. Her last known steps led investigators on a chilling journey into the darkness of one man's twisted past and sparked a desperate hunt that would haunt the small college town of Charlottesville forever. It was a warm September night in 2014, and Charlottesville, Virginia was buzzing with life. Students had just returned to the University of Virginia, filling the historic college town's streets, bars, and coffee shops with chatter and laughter. Among the crowd was 18-year-old Hannah Graham, a second-year student with a promising future. Her disappearance that night sent shockwaves through the community and gripped the nation. What started as a regular Friday night for Hannah soon turned into a sinister, suspense-filled saga, exposing a horrifying story of trust, manipulation, and terror. Hannah Graham was like any other vibrant young student at the University of Virginia, known for her infectious smile and the close-knit group of friends she kept. Originally from Northern Virginia, she had dreams of making a mark on the world and was known for her intellect and empathy. With a deep love for adventure, skiing, and a passion for learning, Hannah's excitement about college life was only growing in her second year. Her friends described her as responsible and aware of her surroundings, which is why the events that unfolded on September 12, 2014, were all the more baffling. That Friday night, Hannah and her friends had planned to attend a few gatherings, a typical weekend activity for students. She wore her usual casual attire, a black crop top, black pants, and white shoes. They started the night at an off-campus apartment, where they mingled and chatted with other students. Around midnight, the group decided to move on to another party. Hannah, slightly intoxicated but in high spirits, lagged behind as her friends moved ahead. Somewhere along the way, she became separated from the group, a seemingly small detail that would soon prove to be a tragic turn of fate. As Hannah walked alone along the busy downtown mall area, she texted a friend around 1:20 a.m., admitting that she was lost. Surveillance cameras captured her walking unsteadily, appearing disoriented. Video footage from the neighboring stores showed her stumbling, pausing at intersections, and at times glancing at her phone, trying to find her way. Her figure, lit by the streetlights, became an eerie last record of her movements. Hannah continued walking along the mall area, eventually passing by a popular restaurant. Witnesses later reported seeing her interacting with a man, though they couldn't hear the details of their conversation. Her friend tried calling her back to get her exact location, but by that time, it was too late. Hannah didn't pick up. Each minute after that became more concerning for those who knew her as a reliable friend. For Hannah, this small, seemingly insignificant moment of becoming separated from her friends set off a chain of events that would ultimately end in a nightmare. The surveillance footage became the focal point of the investigation. Police combed through every detail, analyzing her movements frame by frame to see if they could identify any potential clues. The footage wasn't just a record of a young woman walking, it was, in a chilling way, a record of her last known interactions with the world. In the days to come, her friends, family, and local authorities would watch that footage over and over, trying to piece together how a casual night out could go so terribly wrong. By the following morning, Hannah's absence was painfully evident. Her parents, alarmed by the radio silence, reported her missing. Charlottesville police immediately launched an investigation, sparking an urgent search for the missing teen. The university, city officials, and hundreds of volunteers joined forces to look for her. Posters bearing Hannah's image and details were plastered across the town, and social media was ablaze with the hashtag #FindHannah. Over the days that followed, as hope clung desperately to each lead, authorities painstakingly pieced together Hannah's final steps. Surveillance footage showed Hannah crossing paths with a man just before 1:30 a.m. This man, later identified as Jesse Matthew Jr., was a 32-year-old nursing assistant with a criminal history. He appeared to be guiding Hannah, a scene that immediately raised alarm bells for detectives. What had initially seemed like an innocent interaction soon became a haunting puzzle for the investigators, and Jesse Matthew quickly emerged as the prime suspect. As the search for Hannah intensified, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence surfaced from the surveillance footage. In the early hours of September 13th, approximately an hour after Hannah had last been seen texting her friend, footage captured her in the company of a man. This man would later be identified as Jesse Matthew Jr., a local nursing assistant with a quiet demeanor and a background that most people would never suspect. At first glance, Jesse seemed like a helpful passerby who might have offered guidance to a young woman who looked lost. In the video, he was seen walking alongside Hannah, his movements calm and seemingly protective. Eyewitnesses would later testify that they saw Matthew walking close to her, and one witness even claimed he was holding her gently by the elbow. As they strolled through the street, the encounter had initially seemed benign, possibly even chivalrous. But detectives noticed small details that painted a far darker story. Hannah appeared unsteady on her feet, and Jesse's body language had an element of dominance that became more apparent with repeated viewings of the footage. Police soon learned that Jesse had a reputation in Charlottesville, but not necessarily a positive one. Although he had no criminal convictions, he had been previously questioned in multiple cases of alleged sexual assault. In one incident, a young woman claimed that he had tried to force himself on her after a night out. While charges were never pressed in these cases, a pattern of troubling behavior began to emerge. Detectives realized that Matthew might not be the good Samaritan he appeared to be. The day after Hannah went missing, police found Jesse Matthews' vehicle abandoned on a quiet street on the outskirts of Charlottesville. When they traced it back to him, he initially cooperated with the investigation, even coming to the station to answer questions. But as detectives dug into his story, it became clear that there were inconsistencies. He claimed he had seen Hannah briefly but had no other interactions with her, a statement contradicted by the surveillance footage. As investigators pressed him further, Matthew's demeanor began to shift. He became nervous, his answers evasive. Sensing he was at risk, Jesse abruptly left the interview room before police could detain him. Within hours he vanished, sparking a nationwide manhunt. His sudden disappearance only fueled the suspicion surrounding him, raising the fear that he had not only hurt Hannah, but was now attempting to evade justice entirely. The search for Jesse Matthew became a top priority. Authorities released his photo, along with a description of his last known whereabouts, to media outlets across the country. Public outrage and interest surged as details of his past began to surface. Women from various states came forward with stories eerily similar to Hannah's, some alleging that Matthew had used his charm and persuasive demeanor to manipulate and harm them. With Jesse Matthew finally in custody, the focus turned toward gathering concrete evidence to link him to Hannah Graham's disappearance. The investigation team knew that time was of the essence. They had a suspect, but they didn't have Hannah. Every minute mattered, and each delay could mean vital clues slipping through their fingers. While the Graham family waited anxiously, detectives worked around the clock to secure evidence that could both locate Hannah and build an irrefutable case against Matthew. In the search of Matthew's vehicle, investigators discovered several disturbing clues that connected him to Hannah. Detectives found a strand of hair that matched Hannah's, as well as fibers from her clothing. Even more damning was a trace of blood in the vehicle. Forensic testing confirmed that the blood matched Hannah's DNA, a significant development that pointed toward foul play. However, without a body, law enforcement faced a difficult challenge. They needed additional proof to uncover exactly what had happened after that final encounter captured on surveillance footage. Detectives continued to sift through the surveillance footage of the downtown mall area, piecing together the timeline of events in the hours leading up to Hannah's disappearance. Cell phone records became a pivotal part of the investigation. Matthew's phone pinged in the same areas as Hannah's, establishing that the two had been close to one another as she moved through the downtown area. Even more disturbingly, the data showed that Matthew's phone was active in a remote rural area outside of Charlottesville shortly after Hannah was last seen. This location was far from the city center, in a place where few ventured at that hour. With a clearer location in mind, search teams deployed to the rural area identified by the phone data, combing through dense woods, riverbanks, and remote backroads. It was a painstaking process that required both precision and patience. Just when it seemed they might come up empty-handed, one search party stumbled upon a shallow grave. The forensic team was immediately called to the site. As they unearthed the scene, they discovered human remains later identified as Hannah's. Her family's worst fears were confirmed, leaving a community in mourning but determined to see justice served. The discovery of Hannah's remains added gravity to the case against Matthew. However, as they delved deeper, investigators realized Hannah's case might only be the beginning of a much larger, darker pattern. The circumstances surrounding her murder matched several unsolved cases in the area, leading law enforcement to reopen files and investigate Jesse Matthews' potential connection to other disappearances. What they uncovered shocked everyone. As news of Hannah Graham's tragic fate spread, so did scrutiny of Jesse Matthews' background. The public wanted answers. Who was this man, and how had he evaded justice for so long? Investigators began to dig into his past, unearthing a series of disturbing incidents and allegations that pointed to a history of predatory behavior. What emerged was a pattern of violent tendencies that had left scars on multiple communities. Jesse Matthew was raised in Charlottesville, known in his neighborhood as quiet and unassuming. He had worked in healthcare as a nursing assistant, a position that allowed him to appear caring and responsible. But beneath his calm exterior lay a history of troubling encounters with women. Over the years, Matthew had been the subject of numerous complaints and allegations, yet managed to avoid prosecution each time. Some incidents involved attempted assaults on women who were able to escape, while others recounted strange and uncomfortable interactions that escalated to alarming levels. These incidents were largely swept under the rug, either dismissed due to lack of evidence or because the victims felt unable to press charges. In 2005, Matthew was a suspect in the assault of another young woman at a college where he was briefly enrolled. Police linked him to the crime through physical evidence, but charges were mysteriously dropped. This incident set a precedent for his later interactions with law enforcement, as Matthew learned to manipulate situations and evade accountability. His background check also revealed that he had been asked to leave several institutions, including universities where he'd enrolled and jobs where he worked. Complaints had been filed, investigations were opened, but each time he managed to avoid legal consequences. Hannah's case also prompted investigators to look into another unsolved case, the 2009 disappearance and murder of a young woman named Morgan Harrington, a Virginia Tech student who vanished after attending a concert in Charlottesville. Like Hannah, Morgan was last seen near the downtown mall area, and her remains were later found in a rural field outside the city. The similarities between the two cases were striking, both in terms of location and victim profile. Authorities compared DNA from the Morgan Harrington case to samples found in Jesse Matthews' car, and the results were chilling. Matthews' DNA matched evidence collected from Morgan's body, conclusively linking him to her murder. The confirmation that Jesse Matthew was involved in Morgan Harrington's murder sent shockwaves through the community. Many wondered how a man linked to such violent crimes could have evaded justice for so long. The narrative began to shift from a single tragic case to a story of systemic failures and missed warning signs. Matthew's crimes, it seemed, were enabled by a series of oversights and errors that had allowed him to walk free. The media dubbed him a serial predator, a label that reflected the horrifying reality that he may have had even more victims than those known to police. As the investigation continued, law enforcement officials were tasked with uncovering any further connections between Matthew and unsolved crimes in the region. This deep dive into his past began to reveal a disturbing trend, indicating that he had likely been preying on vulnerable women for years without detection. The grim realization settled in that Hannah's death, tragic as it was, had finally shone a light on a man who had lurked in the shadows for far too long. It was a painful but necessary reckoning that forced the community, law enforcement, and the nation to question how a man capable of such atrocities had managed to evade justice repeatedly. The revelations about Matthew's past cast a dark shadow over the case, leaving Hannah's family and the community grappling with a painful question. Could her death end, perhaps, the deaths of others have been prevented? With the recovery of Hannah's remains, police were now able to pursue Jesse Matthew with renewed vigor. DNA analysis linked him to the 2009 murder of Morgan Harrington, a Virginia Tech student who disappeared under eerily similar circumstances. Like Hannah, Morgan had last been seen alone at night before vanishing without a trace. Her remains were discovered months later in a rural area near Charlottesville, but her case had gone cold. The DNA match was damning evidence that implicated Matthew in both cases. As more details about his background emerged, it became clear that he had used his charm and unassuming demeanor to gain the trust of vulnerable young women, luring them into a false sense of security before committing heinous acts. In June 2015, Jesse Matthew was formally charged with first-degree murder in the case of Hannah Graham. The trial, held under intense public scrutiny, painted a horrifying portrait of Matthew's double life. Witnesses testified to his deceptively calm exterior and his disturbing behavior, leaving little doubt about his guilt. The prosecution argued that he had carefully targeted Hannah, just as he had with Morgan Harrington years earlier, leveraging her disoriented state to manipulate and ultimately harm her. In the face of overwhelming evidence, Matthew chose to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing some measure of justice to the families of Hannah Graham and Morgan Harrington. Hannah's story, while tragic, became a stark reminder of the dangers lurking even in familiar places. Her disappearance and death cast a shadow over the University of Virginia, prompting a reckoning within the community and a reevaluation of safety measures for students. Her family, along with Morgan Harrington's family, became advocates for campus safety, working tirelessly to ensure that their daughters' stories were not forgotten, and that future generations could learn from their unimaginable loss. Hannah Graham's life was cut short in a moment of misplaced trust, but her memory continues to echo in the halls of the University of Virginia, and in the hearts of her family and friends. Her story is a powerful reminder of the importance of vigilance, even in seemingly safe spaces, and a testament to the resilience of those who loved her, as they continue to honor her legacy.